What is mutualism? Not a simple question, as I found out. It's one of the first ideas of how to structure an anarchist society, and it was originally thought of during the aftermath of one of the French monarchies. This is anarchism in the anarchist sense, not the everyday anarchism people mean, which is just chaos, but rather an attempt at a society without unnecessary power structures. I got a video on that. Summed up quickly, this ideology crystallized about the same time Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, and right in the middle of the Industrial Revolution. So by comparison, this ideology can seem dated in some of its views. Back then, both markets and private property were new and promising, so mutualism has both, to some extent. As is in the name, mutualism also heavily relies on voluntary mutual aid. To understand mutualism, you need to understand the conditions in which it first formed. Things like Marxism and anarchism straight up didn't exist, and the French Revolution only established capitalism a good 40 years before then. And again, Marxism was not a thing, so there were no strong criticisms of capitalism yet. Everyone was just happy that they didn't live under feudalism anymore. The term first came up in the aftermath of the First French Empire, and it first became used as a coherent ideology by Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, who was the first self-proclaimed anarchist, by the way, in the year 1848, the same year Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto. And of course, this was Victorian times, so this was in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, which means way fewer people were farmers, and the percent of the people who worked in factory was increasing quickly. And they were miserable because they had no control over the factory at all, in accordance with capitalist laws, where one person can own a factory used by 1,000. In many cases, the countries were monarchies, so the people had no control over the state either. In the revolutions of 1848, the people expressed that they were unhappy by trying to overthrow the monarchies of Europe, which mostly failed except in France, where it was successful and founded the Second French Republic, which then failed 4 years later. But before it failed, Proudhon used it to learn, and he released the solution to the social problem in 1849, in which he basically laid out how mutualism would work, as well as how the workers could get control over the economy from the capitalists. So, let's come to the theory. Mutualism chooses a market as its system of distribution. With your 2021 hindsight, you may be critical of this because we today have a lot of experience with markets and the issues they have, which at the time weren't nearly as understood as it is today. Back then, they only really knew two ways to structure an economy. Mercantilism, in which a country only trades with itself and its colonies, which requires a central government, so not anarchism, and a free market, in which everyone who has something can trade it with anyone, in theory voluntarily. And of course, the second one seems more free. In theory, planned economies existed, but with the state of technology in the mid-1900s, a centrally planned economy would be very hard. And of course, a central planning is not anarchism, so that's a no. And decentral planning was not yet conceived, and the average education was so low that you could assume it wouldn't work. So, market it is. A similar view existed of private property. It was better than feudalism, and the only obvious alternative was the state owning everything. Naturally, neither of these fulfills anarchist ideas. So, because of that, Proudhon and co. supported private property. Sort of. They wanted you to be able to own property under the condition that you actually use it. So if you own land, you better use it yourself because renting it out doesn't count. So anyone else can just take it and farm it themselves. Means of production like factories wouldn't be able to be used by single people, so they would be owned collectively by all the workers, while something like a private weavery by one person would still be owned by that one person. Naturally, no state at all because anarchism. Instead, communes and people representing themselves are the name of the game. And naturally, the same goes for housing. You can only own a house you use, and multi-flat buildings would be communally owned. The mutual aid from which mutualism got its name is exactly what it sounds like. People voluntarily aiding each other. Like me taking care of your dog while you're on holidays, and in exchange you feed my cats once I go on holidays. The emphasis here is on the voluntary aspect. People have to want to aid each other, which means both profit. But how would you transform an early capitalist economy into that? Credit unions. They would operate on a tight margin, only demanding very little interest to cover administration costs. They would provide the capital to the workers to straight up buy out the capitalists, so they could set up a new economic system in the middle of the old one. This is called dual power. They would also not use money backed by gold, but rather labor vouchers, which just said how much work you did, and you could exchange them for labor of equivalent amount. That way everybody would be equal, no matter their job. There were some businesses and communities that used these vouchers in the past, but I can't find a current day instance of these being used. So, let's have a look at the praxis that came from this theory. Mutualism was the first form of anarchism. As such, it was popular in the second half of the 19th century until roughly 1900, when it gave way to systems like syndicalism and later Marxism-Leninism. So, while mutualism has lots of history, it was only involved in one major revolution, and that was the Paris Commune. I made a separate video all about the Commune, and I don't like covering the same topic twice, so click on the link up there or wait until the end card for the link. TLDR, the Paris Commune failed. After that, anarchism and Marxists split, and they never worked together ever since, except for when it comes to shitting on Vosh. Both of them do that. The theorized banking unions didn't stay a theoretical concept. The US was one of the places with the most mutualists, so after a lot of bank crashes, people actually pulled their money together and formed banking or credit unions, which roughly every second person in the nation uses as their bank. The difference to a normal bank is that they are non-profit and that clients become partners of the unions as well. The collective housing also exists in practice. In Austria, it's called Genossenschaft, which would be translated to fellowship in English, and it's a legal entity which is made up of all the people who live on a property, to which all tenants pay a monthly fee which goes toward maintenance and possibly pays off the mortgage that is placed on the building. Note that both American credit unions and Austrian collectively owned houses are used by everyone and not necessarily established by mutualists. They are attractive to your average apolitical as well. Let's get into the criticisms. First of all, it has all the criticism that other forms of anarchism get. It wouldn't be easy to defend communes against imperialism, it's too optimistic, it cannot be achieved quickly, and so on. But it's also criticized for assuming that a market is a way to achieve trade between equals, while many Marxists and more modern anarchists would argue that because of specialization and monopolies, markets always carry the potential for exploitation, not to mention how inefficient they are. I have a video on that. The labor vouchers are also a target of criticism, because spending 3 hours at work doesn't mean you did 3 hours of labor. You could just be taking many breaks or work slow, and labor vouchers won't represent that complexity. Also, the fact that Proudhon wanted to keep credit unions was a point of criticism, because they necessarily rely on the work of others to get paid interest. So even if the interest is low, they are still kinda leeching from the working class. Mikhail Bakunin, another well-known anarchist, said that Proudhon was naive to ignore the complexity of society and the conditions people live in by assuming that all interaction is just convenient and voluntary. Today, mutualism is a bit different than what Proudhon had originally formulated. Who could have guessed? Nowadays, there are mutualists who don't support markets and some who read Capital and changed their minds on labor vouchers. For every feature of mutualism I mentioned here, there are mutualists who don't believe in it. It's all oversimplified to make the video quick to watch. Basically, nowadays mutualists are libertarian socialists with market characteristics, though some modern-day mutualists avoid calling themselves socialists because the world is so connected with the USSR, which is not remotely what mutualists want, so I see why they want to abandon the term. In conclusion, I think it's fair to say mutualism was humanity's first attempt at creating a way to form an anarchist society, which may have some parts which we consider dated today, but which were nonetheless advanced for the time. So we could say mutualism was a stepping stone in the way to modern day anarchism. Thanks for watching.